I wasn't supposed to be home that afternoon. The conference in Chicago had been canceled due to a speaker's sudden illness, and instead of calling Richard to let him know I was catching an earlier flight, I decided to surprise him. 23 years of marriage, and I still believed in surprising my husband. God, how naive I was. The house was quiet when I pulled into the driveway, my suitcase rolling behind me as I approached the front door. Richard's Mercedes was parked in its usual spot, which meant he was working from home, nothing unusual for a Wednesday. What was unusual was a white BMW parked beside it. I recognized that car. It belonged to Vanessa, my son Tyler's fiancée. A cold sensation crept down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. There was no reason for Vanessa to be at our house alone with Richard. Tyler was in New York on business, wouldn't be back until Friday. Still, I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe she needed advice on wedding planning. Maybe she wanted to discuss the venue deposit we'd offered to pay. Maybe... I pushed open the front door, and the explanation I'd been constructing in my head crumbled to dust. The sounds came first. Before I saw anything, I heard them, muffled but unmistakable, coming from upstairs, from the master bedroom. My legs moved on their own, carrying me up the staircase I'd climbed 10,000 times. Each step felt like wading through concrete. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I saw them. My husband of 23 years, the father of my only child, the man who had promised to love, honor, and cherish me until death do us part. And there she was, Vanessa Chen, the 28-year-old woman my son had proposed to 6 months ago, the woman we'd welcomed into our family, the woman who had looked me in the eyes during Sunday dinners and called me Mom. They were so lost in each other that they didn't notice me standing there, frozen in the doorway, my world collapsing around me like a house of cards in a hurricane. Richard. My voice came out strange, disconnected from my body, but it was enough. Richard's head snapped toward me, and in that moment I watched his face transform from passion to horror. Vanessa scrambled to cover herself, grabbing for the sheaths, my sheaths, her perfect porcelain features twisting into an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it shame, fear, or something else entirely? Margaret? Richard's voice cracked. Don't. The word was ice. I was ice. Everything inside me had frozen solid, a survival mechanism I didn't know I possessed. Don't you dare say another word. I turned and walked away, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a metronome counting down to an explosion. Behind me, I heard the chaos of scrambling, clothes being thrown on, desperate whispers exchanged, but I kept walking, down the stairs, through the foyer, out the door. I made it to my car before the first sob escaped my throat. To understand the depth of my devastation, you need to understand what I thought I had. Richard Montgomery was the love of my life, or so I believed. We met when I was 25, a junior editor at a publishing house, and he was 30, an ambitious financial advisor with dreams bigger than our small New England town could contain. He was charming, brilliant, and when he looked at me, I felt like the most important person in the universe. We built an empire together. His financial consulting firm grew into one of the most successful in the state. I eventually became a senior editor at a prestigious publishing house. We bought our dream home, a stunning colonial with 4 bedrooms and a wraparound porch. And then came Tyler.
Our son was everything to us. Brilliant like his father, creative like me, with a heart bigger than he knew what to do with. Watching him grow up was the greatest joy of my life. And when he brought Vanessa home for the first time, 18 months ago, I thought my happiness was complete. "Mom, Dad, this is Vanessa," Tyler had said, his eyes shining with a love I recognized, the same look Richard used to give me. "She's the one." Vanessa was beautiful, there was no denying it. Long black hair that cascaded down her back like silk, almond-shaped eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a smile that could light up any room. She was a marketing consultant, she told us, recently moved from California to pursue opportunities on the East Coast. "It's so wonderful to finally meet Tyler's family," she'd said, squeezing my hands warmly. "I feel like I already know you." I felt an instant connection to her. Richard, however, had been strangely quiet during that first dinner. When I asked him about it later, he'd brushed it off. "She's lovely," he'd said. "I'm happy for Tyler." But there was something in his eyes I couldn't read, something I'd never seen before. Looking back now, I recognize it for what it was. Recognition, fear, the look of a man watching his past catch up with him. For 3 days after I discovered them, I didn't return home. I checked into a hotel under a fake name, turned off my phone, and cried until I had no tears left. Then I started thinking, really thinking. The betrayal was almost too enormous to process. My husband, the man I trusted implicitly, had been sleeping with my son's fiancée. But even through the pain, questions began surfacing, questions that wouldn't let me rest. How long had this been going on? Since Vanessa entered our lives 18 months ago? Longer? And why? What could possibly drive Richard to risk everything, his marriage, his relationship with Tyler, his reputation, for this woman? Unless a thought struck me with the force of a physical blow. What if this wasn't just an affair? What if there was something else going on? I reached for my laptop, my hands trembling as I opened a search engine. I typed in Vanessa Chen, marketing consultant, California. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No LinkedIn profile, no company affiliations, no trace of her professional existence whatsoever. My heart began to race. I tried variations. Vanessa Chen, San Francisco. Vanessa Chen, Los Angeles. Vanessa Chen, marketing. Each search came up empty. It was as if Vanessa Chen didn't exist before 18 months ago, before she walked into my son's life. Something dark and cold settled in my stomach. This was wrong. This was all very, very wrong. I picked up my phone with shaking hands and called the one person I knew who could help me find answers. "Hello?" My sister's voice came through worried. She'd been trying to reach me for days. "Margaret, where the hell have you been? Richard's been calling me nonstop." "I need your help," I interrupted. "Your husband still works for the police department, right? I need him to run a background check off the books." There was a pause. "What's going on?" "I caught Richard cheating," I said flatly, "with Tyler's fiancée." The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. "I'll call David right now," Sarah finally said, her voice hard as steel. "Give her name." 2 days later, I met with David at a coffee shop far from our town, far from anyone who might recognize us. He slid a manila folder across the table to me, his expression grim. "You're not going to like what's in there," he warned. I opened it anyway. The first page contained a photograph, not of Vanessa as I knew her, but of a younger version, maybe 20 years old. Her hair was shorter, styled differently, and her eyes held a hardness that I'd never noticed before, but it was unmistakably her. "Her real name is Grace Sullivan," David said quietly. "Born in Portland, Maine, her mother was Helen Sullivan." The name meant nothing to me. I shook my head, confused. "Keep reading," David urged. I flipped to the next page, which contained a newspaper article from 15 years ago. The headline made my blood run cold. "Local woman commits suicide after financial ruin." Below the headline was a photo of a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a tired smile. Helen Sullivan, and the article detailed how she had invested her entire life savings, everything she had, with a financial consulting firm that had promised guaranteed returns. The investment turned out to be fraudulent, and she lost everything. Unable to face the shame and poverty that followed, Helen Sullivan hanged herself in her bedroom. Her 13-year-old daughter, Grace, found the body, and the name of the financial consultant who had taken her mother's money, Richard Montgomery. The folder slipped from my hands, papers scattering across the table. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Everything I thought I knew about my husband, about my life, about Vanessa, Grace, was fragmenting into a million pieces. "There's more," David said softly. I looked back at him, my vision blurred with tears. After her mother's death, Grace was placed in foster care. She bounced around for 5 years until she aged out of the system. Then she disappeared. No records, no trace of her, until about 3 years ago when she resurfaced as Vanessa Chen. He paused. "Margaret, this woman didn't accidentally meet your son. She targeted your family. She spent years planning this." "But why?" My voice broke. "Why would she sleep with Richard? If she wanted revenge, why not just expose him, destroy his reputation?" David's expression was unreadable. "I don't know, but I think you need to find out before this goes any further. Before I told Tyler, before I destroyed my son's heart along with my own." I didn't go home after meeting with David. Instead, I drove to Vanessa's apartment, the sleek, modern loft she'd moved into 6 months ago, just after the engagement. I'd helped her pick out furniture for this place. I hung curtains in her living room. And now I was here to destroy her. She answered the door in yoga pants and a silk blouse, her face registering genuine shock when she saw me standing there. "Margaret?" I pushed past her into the apartment, spinning around to face her once I was inside. "Your name isn't Vanessa. It's Grace. Grace Sullivan." The color drained from her face. For a moment she was frozen, every muscle rigid. Then slowly a change came over her. The mask she'd worn for 18 months slipped away, revealing someone harder, colder, more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. "So you found out," she said quietly. There was no fear in her voice, no remorse. "No remorse. You targeted my family. You seduced my son. You slept with my husband," each word with a blade, and I wanted them to cut deep. "All because of what Richard did to your mother 15 years ago? What Richard did? You make it sound so simple. What Richard did was destroy my mother. He took everything from her, her savings, her dignity, her hope. And when she tried to fight back, when she tried to expose him, do you know what he did?" I stayed silent, dread pooling in my stomach. "He threatened her, told her he had connections, that he'd make sure she lost custody of me if she didn't keep quiet. So she kept quiet. She kept quiet until the shame and the poverty and the hopelessness ate her alive, and she decided the only way out was a rope around her neck." Tears were streaming down Grace's face now, but her voice remained steady. "I was 13 years old. I found her hanging in her bedroom. I called 911. I held her hand until the paramedics came, even though she was already cold. And I made myself a promise that day. I promised I would make Richard Montgomery pay for what he did." "So you seduced him. That was your revenge? Becoming his mistress?" Grace's expression shifted, becoming something I couldn't read. "You don't understand. I didn't plan for what happened with Richard. I came here for Tyler. My plan was to marry him, become part of your family, and then destroy you all from the inside. I was going to take everything, the money, the reputation, the happiness, just like Richard took everything from my mother." "Then why?" "Because Richard recognized me. The first night Tyler brought me home for dinner, Richard took one look at me and knew exactly who I was. After dinner, when everyone else had gone to bed, he cornered me in the kitchen. He knew. And instead of exposing me, instead of protecting his son from me, do you know what he did?" I shook my head, though I dreaded the answer. "He offered me money to disappear. $2 million to walk away and never come back. Grace's laugh was sharp and humorless, and when I refused, he'd try a different approach. He started coming to my apartment, calling me, texting me. At first, I thought he was trying to intimidate me into leaving, but then I realized he was attracted to me. This man who destroyed my mother was attracted to her daughter. The horror of it washed over me in waves. So I used it. I let him think he was seducing me. I let him believe he was in control. And all the while, I was gathering evidence. Bank statements from 15 years ago that he thought were destroyed. Testimony from other victims he defrauded. A paper trail that leads directly to him. She walked to a drawer in her desk and pulled out a thick folder, tossing it on the table between us. Your husband didn't just cheat people out of their money, Margaret. He ran a Ponzi scheme for almost a decade. My mother wasn't his only victim. There were dozens of them, but he was careful. He paid people off. He destroyed evidence. He made sure no one could touch him. Until now. Everything is in there. Everything I've collected over the past 3 years, enough to send Richard to prison for the rest of his life. I stared at the folder, my mind reeling. The man I'd married, the man I'd spent 23 years of my life with, the father of my child, he wasn't who I thought he was. He'd never been who I thought he was. Why are you showing me this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Grace's expression softened slightly, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her. Because I never wanted to hurt you, Margaret, or Tyler. I watched you both for months before I made my move. You're good people, kind people. You had nothing to do with what Richard did to my mother, but I couldn't separate you from him. I tried, but by the time I realized I actually cared about Tyler, it was too late. I was in too deep. You cared about him? I couldn't keep the disbelief in my voice. You loved him. Grace's admission was raw, painful. I still love him. None of this was supposed to happen the way it did. I was supposed to be cold, calculating. I was supposed to break your family and walk away. But Tyler, she broke off, wiping her eyes. He's nothing like his father. He's everything his father pretends to be. I sat down heavily, unable to stand any longer. My entire life had become a lie within the span of a few days, and I was still struggling to process it all. There's something else, Grace said after a long moment. Something I haven't told anyone. Something I need you to know before you decide what to do with that folder. I looked up at her, exhausted beyond measure. The affair with Richard, I recorded everything, every encounter, every conversation. I have videos and audio that prove he knew exactly who I was and pursued me anyway. I have evidence that he offered me money to disappear, evidence that he threatened me when I refused, evidence that he... She stopped, swallowing hard. Evidence of what? Grace turned away, hugging herself tightly. The night before you came home early, Richard found out about some of the documents I'd collected. He confronted me about it. He was angry, angrier than I'd ever seen him. And he told me, she took a shaky breath, he told me my mother wasn't the only one who died because of him. A chill ran through me. There was another woman, Elena Vance. She was one of his clients back before he married you. She lost everything in his scheme, like my mother did. But unlike my mother, she didn't stay quiet. She gathered evidence. She was going to go to the police. What happened to her? Grace turned back to face me, and her eyes were haunted. She died in a car accident, single vehicle, drove off a bridge at 2 a.m. The police ruled it a suicide. She paused. Richard told me it wasn't. He told me he had people who could make problems disappear. He told me that if I didn't hand over everything I'd collected, I would disappear too. The room spun around me. My husband, the man who kissed my cheek every morning, who brought me coffee in bed on Sundays, who danced with me at our son's engagement party, was a monster, a thief, and possibly a murderer. "Why didn't you run?" I asked. "Why didn't you take this to the police?" "Because I needed more proof. Richard is careful. He never does his own dirty work. There's a man, Victor Reith. He handles Richard's problems. I've been trying to connect them to prove that Richard was behind Elena's death. If I can do that," Rich's voice hardened, "if I can prove Richard killed that woman, it's not just fraud charges, it's murder, and he'll never see the outside of a prison cell again." I stood up abruptly, pacing the room. My mind was racing, trying to reconcile the man I'd loved with the monster Grace was describing. But even as I searched for a way to deny it, pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Richard's late nights he'd attributed to work, the unexplained cash deposits I'd noticed years ago and been told not to worry about, the secretary who'd left suddenly, refusing to return my calls, the nervous tension he always carried, the way he'd jump when the phone rang unexpectedly. I'd spent 23 years ignoring red flags, telling myself I was imagining things, choosing blindness over truth. "What do you want from me?" I finally asked. Grace stepped closer, her expression earnest. "I want you to help me take him down. You have access that I don't, to his office, his computer, his files. There's a safe in his study, isn't there? I've seen him go in there late at night when he thinks everyone's asleep. I need to know what's inside." I knew the safe she was talking about. Richard had always been cagey about it, claiming it held important financial documents and nothing more. I'd never pressed the issue. "And if I help you, what happens to Tyler?" Grace's face crumpled. "I'll disappear. I'll give you everything, all the evidence against Richard, and I'll vanish. Tyler never has to know about any of it. He can hate me for leaving, blame me for breaking his heart, but he doesn't have to know what his father is. He doesn't have to carry that." "You're willing to walk away from him? If you love him like you claim—" "That's exactly why I'm willing to walk away." Grace's voice was fierce. "Tyler deserves better than me. He deserves someone who didn't come into his life with an agenda, someone who isn't broken and consumed by revenge. But before I go, I'm going to make sure his father can never hurt anyone else again."
I studied her for a long moment. This young woman who had lost everything, who had spent 15 years planning vengeance, who had somehow fallen in love with the son of her enemy. She was manipulative, dangerous, damaged beyond repair. But she was also a victim, and despite everything, I believed her. "The safe combination is 081572, I heard myself say. Our wedding anniversary. Richard thought it was romantic. Grace's eyes widened. "You're helping me?" "That man killed your mother. He might have killed others. He's been lying to me for our entire marriage." I took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside me, a hardening, a resolve. "I'm not doing this for you, Grace. I'm doing this for every woman he's destroyed. I'm doing this for myself, and I'm doing this for Tyler, because he deserves to know the truth about the man he calls father." The next 3 weeks were the most harrowing of my life. I returned home pretending nothing had changed. I slept in the same bed as Richard, ate breakfast across from him, smiled and nodded as he spun his usual web of lies. Every night while he slept, I crept to his study and photographed documents. Every day while he was at work, I searched for hidden files, secret accounts, buried evidence. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. Richard hadn't just run a Ponzi scheme. He'd built an empire of fraud, stretching back decades. Hundreds of victims, millions of dollars stolen, and at the center of it all, a network of corruption that included judges, police officers, and politicians who had all been paid to look the other way. Elena Vance wasn't his only problem that had been eliminated. There were at least 3 others, investors who had gotten too close to the truth and had met convenient, untraceable ends. And through it all, I had been his perfect cover, the devoted wife, the respectable editor, the mother of his son. I had legitimized him without ever knowing it. On the day we finally had everything we needed, I met Grace at a diner outside of town. She looked different, thinner, more exhausted, but with a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "It's over," she said, sliding the USB drive across the table. "I handed everything to the FBI this morning. They're building a case. Richard will be arrested within the week." I should have felt triumph. Instead, I just felt tired. "What about Tyler?" I asked. Grace's face fell. "I told him everything. Last night, I couldn't let him find out from the news." My heart clenched. How did he take it? He didn't say a word. He just sat there, listening, and when I was finished, he asked me to leave. A tear slipped down her cheek. He looked at me like a stranger, like everything we had was a lie. "Some of it was," I said gently. "I know, but not all of it." She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "I know I have no right to ask you this, but will you tell him? Will you tell him that some of it was real, that I really did love him?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Tyler. "Mom, I need you. Please come home." Richard was arrested 4 days later, at his office, in front of his colleagues and clients. The footage made national news, the respected financial advisor being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He genuinely believed he was untouchable. The trial took 8 months. I testified against him, detailing everything I had discovered, everything I had chosen to ignore for years. Grace testified too, telling her mother's story to a packed courtroom, finally giving Helen Sullivan a voice. In the end, Richard was convicted on 47 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and 3 counts of murder for hire. He received 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He never looked at me once during the entire trial. Tyler was devastated. But in a way that surprised me, he was also strong. He threw himself into therapy, into rebuilding his sense of self, into understanding how he could have been so blind to his father's true nature. It was a struggle I understood all too well. He didn't speak to Grace for months after the trial. I thought perhaps that chapter was closed for good. But one evening, almost a year later, Tyler came to me with a question I wasn't expecting. "Do you think people can change, Mom? Really change down to their core?" I considered the question carefully. I think everyone has the capacity for change, but it takes courage, it takes accountability, and it takes time. "Grace reached out to me," he admitted. "She's been going to therapy. She's working with victims of financial fraud, helping them navigate the legal system, fight back against the people who destroyed them." He paused. "She says she doesn't expect me to forgive her. She just wanted me to know that she's trying to be someone worth forgiving." I studied my son's face, seeing the conflict there, the love he still held, warring with the betrayal he'd experienced. "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I don't know." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Part of me wants to hate her forever, but another part, I can't stop thinking about what she went through, what her mother went through, what Dad put both of them through." "Tyler, whatever you decide, I'll support you. But let me tell you something I've learned from all of this." I took his hands in mine. "Grace made terrible choices.
She lied to you, manipulated you, used you for revenge, but she also saved us. Without her, we would have gone on living our lives never knowing the truth. Richard would have continued hurting people, and eventually his lies would have caught up with all of us in ways we couldn't control. I squeezed his hands tightly. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it does make her more than just a villain. And in my experience, the world is rarely divided into heroes and villains. Most of us are just people trying to survive the best way we know how. I sold the house. I couldn't live there anymore, not with the ghosts of all those lies haunting every corner. I moved to a small cottage by the sea, started writing a memoir about my experience, and slowly began rebuilding a life that was entirely my own. Tyler eventually forgave Grace, not fully, not completely, but enough to allow her back into his life. They didn't get married, that ship had sailed, but they became something else, something harder to define. Partners in healing, perhaps. Two people bound by trauma, working through it together. Grace started a foundation in her mother's name, helping victims of financial fraud seek justice. She was tireless in her work, driven by a guilt that I suspected would never fully fade. But she was also, finally, at peace. And me? I learned to forgive myself for not seeing the truth sooner, for choosing comfort over curiosity, for building a life on a foundation of sand. Most importantly, I learned that shock and pain don't have to define you. They can, if you let them, become the catalyst for change, for growth, for becoming someone stronger than you ever knew you could be. I thought my husband's betrayal would destroy me. I thought discovering that my son's fiancée was a woman consumed by revenge would break our family beyond repair. Instead, it set us free. The woman behind the veil wasn't just Grace Sullivan seeking vengeance. She was a mirror, showing us all the truths we'd been too afraid to see. And though the reflection was painful, though it shattered everything we thought we knew, it ultimately gave us something more valuable than any lie could provide: the chance to start again.